الإخوة والأخوات الكرام، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته.
Ladies and gentlemen, we start this session now. This session is entitled U.S. Relations with Regional and International Powers in North Africa, and sometimes people do not realize that the vast majority of Arabs reside in the African continent, but when people talk about the Arab world, the attention usually goes to the east of the Red Sea, because of the Palestinian cause being a central cause for all Arabs. May the attention always goes to that part of the world. So therefore this session is of particular importance because we deal with the area from Egypt to Mauritania, and our first speaker today is Mr. Yahia Zoubir. He will be presenting on the United States and the Maghreb-Sahel from neglect to security priority. Professor Yahia Zoubir is Professor of International Relations and Geopolitics at KEDGE School in France, and he taught in the United States, China, Germany, Mexico, Iran, and he has a number of books on the foreign policy of the United States and governance and dispute settlement, etc. Now I give the floor to Professor Zoubir. He has 15 minutes.
السلام عليكم، شكرا جزيلا. التقديم نتاعي يكون باللغة الإنجليزية. The Maghreb in U.S. policy quite often is, the importance at least of the Maghreb tends to be exaggerated at times by the media or some French scholars who, like in the 1990s, suggesting that the Americans were trying to supplant the France in the area, and that was mostly in the 90s. But my research questions have always been whether that was true or whatever, what kind of truth there was to it from that perspective. And I have always argued that at least before 9/11, this was not the case. The Maghreb was marginal. But this being said, there were different periods. If you had to have some sort of periodization regarding U.S. policy in the Maghreb, there were periods that were more important than others. For instance, you can pinpoint to the 1950s during the era of decolonization. Then you had, in 1975, for instance, with the Western Sahara conflict. In the 1990s, with the change in the, there was some, after the 1899, in Eastern Europe, and also some of the changes that were taking place in the Maghreb itself, the uprising in Algeria in 1988, which resulted in some big reforms and so on and so forth. So the main argument in my paper, though, is that U.S. interest for the Maghreb has become strategic following the terrorist attacks of 9/11 and has grown considerably. And in terms of regional security, and this is one of my main areas of focus, Washington has already downgraded, I would argue, Europe's, mainly France's influence in that regard. So in the 1990s, I would argue that the relations between the transatlantic relations, that is between Europe and the United States, were more complementary, but it has become obvious that the US nowadays plays a role of leadership, and I will discuss this in a minute. And it has extended, because most of the time we talk about the Maghreb-Sahel, but in the last 4 or 5 years, in my writings, I've been talking about, U.S. policy towards the Maghreb-Sahel. Not that there is a regional policy. I will always say that the U.S., except maybe for the 1990s when it was pushing for an integrated region in the Maghreb, which would extend, although Libya was not included at that time, but there was a sort of vision, a global vision, where regional trade zones and so on would play a role in the world of globalization, following the fall of the Berlin Wall and so on and so forth. One argument I will be making today, and I know my colleagues at this table will be talking about Morocco and Libya, but I will talk about them briefly, and I know that Michel Dunn has also mentioned Tunisia, and I will maybe highlight 1 or 2 points on Tunisia where I may not share totally her views. But following U.S. policy in the Maghreb for many years, I can state without, being, wrong on that point, that in many ways, Obama followed the same policies as his predecessor, as far as the Maghreb is concerned. There is continuity rather than real change, despite the fact that in the Maghreb region, most people felt, okay, there might be some change because, maybe Obama will be less militaristic and so on and so forth. And that maybe from a popular perspective, that he would push for more democratization and so on and so forth. So, and I think I would argue that like what happened for the rest of, the Middle East and North Africa, in the Maghreb, the U.S. as of 2006 had basically put aside any effort of, democratization after the Hamas victory in Palestine, in Gaza, that was no longer on the table, and the U.S. was willing to live with semi-authoritarian or semi-democratic states, whichever way you want to call them, as long as they were, as they served U.S. interests. One person this morning or yesterday, I don't recall, said that the U.S. opposed political Islam. And I wanted to open a little parenthesis here that regarding Algeria, the United States in the 1990s was divided on the question of political Islam, and even considered Algeria as a laboratory where maybe if we have, some moderate Islamists, come to power, it would not be so bad. And Algeria, from the perspective of Washington, was different in that it had never had a close relationship with Algeria for reasons that I can discuss in the Q&A if you wish. So, in that regard, as I said, there is more continuity than change in terms of U.S. policy. So I wanted, since there was never, in my mind, a genuine regional policy towards the Maghreb, like there is vis-a-vis the Near East. It's always very important to look at the bilateral relations. When you ask U.S. officials, they say, well, yeah, we do have a regional, but it's also bilateral. But really, the bilateral, from my perspective, has been overwhelming rather than the other way around. So, I would like to look, because I know I'm limited in time. I was expecting half an hour or so, but this is not the case. I would like to just touch upon Morocco, and I know Idriss, please don't be mad at me. I would just say that Morocco, regardless of what Algerians say and foreign observers say, Morocco remains the remain central to U.S. policy in the Maghreb. No matter what, despite the fact that Algeria has become critical. And I would argue also that the United States today is looking for proxies and has tried to use Algeria as far as security is concerned, because it's the strongest military in the region, to use Algeria as a proxy as far as the Sahel is concerned. And after the what occurred in Tunisia and Libya, now the push from Washington is to tell the Algerians, oh, you're great, you're strong, you have to use your strength, to play a greater role in Tunisia and Libya. There are even, talks about the Algerians having entered into Libya, sending commandos and all. I can assure you there is no truth to it. The only truth there is that the Algerian special forces exfiltrated the Algerian ambassador and his family with the consent of the authorities in Libya, whatever authorities mean in Libya nowadays. So, as I said, Morocco remains very important, and more so after 9/11, and more so after 2003, when Morocco was victim of some terrorist attacks. Morocco quickly is... All right, then, okay, I'll let Morocco and for you guys, and you can deal with it. Morocco has benefited from the free trade zone with, a free trade area with the United States. It's a non-NATO ally, a major non-NATO ally, and so on and so forth. So that I will pass. Algeria has, become part of the security belt, but at the same time, Algerians are very suspicious of the United States and vice versa, because there is this long history where, even in the Algerian psyche, the United States had supported, colonial France in Algeria. And so that has remained basically. But there is great cooperation in the area of security and military, but Algeria does not need any foreign aid or any U.S. aid except for the international military education training. Algeria got $950,000 in fiscal year 2010, but now it has gone up to a little bit more in 2014. Where did I disagree with Michel on Tunisia? Tunisia was always like the jewel of the United States. And not only was it pro-Western after its independence, and Habib Bourguiba had taken really a strong pro-Western position, cooperated with the United States, military base, and so on and so forth. And Tunisia was considered a success story. And Michel, when we were discussing earlier, he said, well, they were not so, they didn't get as much money because economically, Tunisia had succeeded in not getting foreign aid from the others, and the United States was saying, you see, Tunisia does not need any foreign aid, it has done it on its own. So that was, because of privatization, and, there was some sort of ideology that corresponded. But remember, even under Ben Ali, there were at least 11 military maneuvers, joint maneuvers with Tunisia. And I'll tell you one thing that I learned at the State Department. The State Department, they used to tell me, well, the DOD, Defense Department, is the lobby for Tunisia. Even when we decide to, to try to put human rights on the table, DOD would say, shut up. And it was end of story. The only time, to my knowledge, when the United States sort of officially or publicly said something negative about Tunisia to Ben Ali was in 2004 when, Colin Powell openly said, you have to deal with, with a human rights issue. But then Rumsfeld went to Tunisia and it was okay. And on the eve of 2011, the military cooperation continued and so on and so forth. I will also say something, because I'm not sure if Youssef had said it in his paper. I would say the same about Libya. About Libya, following what happened in 2008 was basically when the situation was, the relationship was normalized, if you wish, after the last payments of the $2.7 billion, and I still argue and I can still swear that the Libyans were not responsible for the Lockerbie bombing. But at the same time, don't forget that even before, now that you talk about Libya and the changes, right before the 2011, the U.S. had entered a sort of, a pact, a military agreement, and they were asking even Libya what kind of military hardware they needed, and then they even fixed the old, C-130s and so on and so forth. Who did I forget now? Well, regarding the Western Sahara, it has become the same. The United States has maintained the same position. Hillary Clinton repeated that, for instance, the autonomy that the Moroccans have offered in the territory that they have illegally occupied since 1975, she said, the autonomy started with the Clinton administration, continued with the Bush administration, and we would continue today. The United States, despite the rhetoric, about human rights and so on, the United States refused to incorporate in the mandate of MINURSO, which is the peacekeeping, which is the force for the referendum in Western Sahara. They refused to include that because the Moroccans, made a big deal out of it and opposed it. And of course, as far as Western Sahara is concerned, it is mostly France that dictates that. So I don't have time to get into many others, and I don't want the chairs to jump out of the table. So I will stop here, but basically to say, in a nutshell, that as far as the Maghreb is concerned, if you want to look at the defense spending and so on and so forth, it has remained the same. Tunisia, that, when Michel talked about it, Tunisia used to get 15 million or so. It got 60 million for fiscal year 2014, 20 million of which are in security aid. So, the military dimension is continuing. I would argue that in real estate, you say location, location, location. In the Obama administration, counterterrorism, 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 which led even as far as Algeria is concerned, despite the rigged, or not even just rigged, but the fourth mandate for Bouteflika, who is basically non-functional, but the United States did not object or did not make any issue out of it, because Algeria plays a critical role as far as counterterrorism is concerned in the region. The U.S. is pushing right now Algeria to play a greater role in Tunisia and Libya as far, to defend the borders and so on and so forth. Thank you very much.
شكرا الأستاذ يحيى الزبير ونرجو أن تمنحوا أسئلة
I kindly ask you to address questions to him at the end of the session. We have with us Mr. Idriss Lakrini, who is a professor in Al-Qadi Ayyad University in Marrakesh, and he is head of the Manara Forum for Development Studies, and he has a number of writings, including about the post-9/11 implications, and also writings about law, public law. He studied at King Mohammed V University, and he's going to talk to us about the strategic dimensions of US-Moroccan relations. He has 15 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Thank you for allowing me this opportunity to address you and to make the most of the interventions in this gathering. I have a number of observations that I believe are fundamental. The location of Morocco made it, historically speaking, an open area to its neighboring countries, to its surroundings. From a strategic perspective, the geographical location may be an element of strength if it was well invested. Also, other strength are not valuable unless they are well invested in. I go back to Morocco. The Sahara issue remained a key factor in its foreign relations. Its foreign policy remained non-confrontational, very peaceful, and it was also in support of international legitimacy. There's also a political hegemony or a monopoly, sorry, mainly French monopoly when it comes to the relationships with Morocco. Morocco decided to overcome this monopoly and decided to variate its partnerships, mainly by forging ties with the United States, who were highly concerned with the region, especially after the 9/11 events. From a realistic and pragmatic perspective, and while also taking into consideration that interests play a major role in forging the ties, building ties with the US is fundamental for Morocco in view of the importance of the superpower on the international scene. First, the general framework of the ties. The US-Moroccan relations are not recent. Historically, they go back a long way, centuries long. Morocco was the first country to recognize the independence of the US, and the ties started in 1786. The US supported the Moroccan independence. Also, the US considered Morocco to be an ally, a friendly country during the Cold War. Despite the historical importance of these relations, however, we should not rely on this in an exaggerated way. During the Reagan era, he tried to reinforce these relations. However, they remained very limited because of the ties with France. During the second Gulf crisis, Morocco joined the U.S. alliance and sent 1,300 soldiers into KSA for a defensive mission, and it preserved a balanced stance. And then the U.S. took the initiative of rescheduling the Moroccan debts. And after the 9/11 events, these ties greatly developed in a multidimensional way. Before I raise these dimensions, I have to observe that there are two main trends after the 9/11 attacks when it comes to the US-Moroccan relations. First of which is that the US was greatly concerned with Africa for both security and economic reasons. During the same period of time, there was a trend by Morocco to multiply its partners and reinforce the ties with a number of countries, including the US. What are the factors that support the US concern with Morocco? First, Morocco's strategic geographical location. This is the gate into Africa, into Europe, and it also overlooks the Gibraltar. Also, it is a very important power, and it preserves a very balanced a relationship with the international countries. A third of all, the issue of counterterrorism, as well as the political stability that Morocco undergoes in a feverish region, and the fact that it pays the lowest price when it comes to revolutions and other such movements, which makes it a valuable power in the region. There is also a very a gradual and smooth integration of Islamic movements, and here we talk about the Justice and Development Party. And also Morocco took part in a number of peacekeeping missions in the region. Now for the political dimension, it shows in a lot of stances where the two countries adopted the same positions. We talk about the Camp David peace agreement, the Madrid agreement, the Oslo agreement, as well as its stance towards the second Gulf War and the last visit of the Moroccan king to the US, which showed different stances in line with the US stances. Morocco also condemned the 9/11 and took part in the counterterrorism campaign by an exchange of data and information. It also issued the counterterrorism law. It also consolidated and anchored moderate Islam. It took a number of initiatives to dismantle terrorist units. It took part in the different campaigns, or it's playing a very important role when it comes to Libya, when it comes to Syria. The US support constitutional and political reforms in Morocco, and it welcomed the latest legislative elections that pushed the set party into power. What are the Moroccan dimensions for diversifying this relationship? To overcome the European monopoly, also including UN support when it comes to autonomous regime in the Sahara, also playing an important international law and therefore an important regional law. What about the United States? It seeks entering a Moroccan market that has great promising opportunities, reinforcing security in a strategic area. And here we talk about the comprehensive definition of national security that is transboundary, also relying on Morocco's role in reinforcing stability and security in the region to counter terrorism, secret migration, and human trafficking, and also opening the gates before the United States into a huge African market, as well as his, thanks, of course, to Morocco's historical ties with the region. Despite all this, the relationship remained very limited until the 90s. Here we record a number of tax reduction and tax exemption conventions, economic and trade conventions in 1995. However, in 2004, free trade agreement was signed by the two parties. It entered into force in 2006, and this was a main shift in the economic and trade ties with the two countries, also when it comes to the environmental and intellectual property issues. This is the second agreement of a kind in the Arab region. This agreement was considered an unprecedented foreign policy initiative that doesn't fall or hinge upon economic ties only, but also has to do with counterterrorism purposes. What is the US to gain from this agreement? It would reinforce capitalism in the region. It would allow it African market access. It would allow it to benefit from the opportunities in the Moroccan market. It would help it overcome trade barriers. It would be able to compete with international and mainly European competitors in this market, especially that growth rate in African countries is considered one of the highest globally. What will Morocco benefit from this agreement? It will open up to the international economy. It will integrate the international economic landscape. It will help reinforce its ties with the United States. The results of this agreement: immediately after this agreement was signed, there was a huge shift in the volume and the trade volume, which reached in 2011 $3.79 billion. As for the bilateral exchange, it increased more than 300%. There's more than 120 US companies currently operating in Morocco and investing around $2.2 billion. The United States is currently the fourth trade partner with Morocco and the fifth when it comes to exports. Morocco is one of the best 5 Arab markets for the US. Some considered that the US, despite all this, is the main beneficiary of this agreement because the Moroccan economy is very weak and its products are not good enough to enter the US market. However, this will undoubtedly promote competitiveness and the quality of Moroccan products. Another issue with the agreement is that it wasn't truly publicly discussed. It was held behind closed doors. Therefore, it became a target for critics. Now, on a security level, after independence since 1965, the US continued perceiving Morocco as an ally. After 9/11, the relationships moved from a cooperative relations into strategic relations, taking part in the U.S. counterterrorism campaign and exchange of data and information was also improved in 2003 after the terrorist attacks that Morocco underwent. We're talking also about Morocco dismantling a number of terrorism units that mobilize terrorists and sends them, dispatches them to Iraq. Morocco was considered a strategic partner outside the NATO alliance, and this will provide it with a number of privileges benefiting from military technology, taking part in some common maneuvers and trainings, as is the case with other African countries. Also, Morocco is able to establish a certain balance in the country, especially with Al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb. AQIM was very active. The US also raised the possibility of establishing a military base. However, this was rejected because, or for fear of popular uprising and for fear of retaliation by armed groups. In 2012, a strategic dialogue was launched between the two countries. It encompasses a number of issues at all levels in order to reinforce these ties. Last but not least, what are the regional and bilateral implications of these relations? When it comes to the Sahara issue, the US position thereon was dictated by a number of stances. First, supporting the efforts to find a continuous, permanent and peaceful solution, supporting the option of negotiations with the UN intervention. Third, recognizing the seriousness of this autonomous solution that Morocco suggested, especially that this project validates sharing, power sharing in view of the challenges that would further arise if this issue is not solved. Fourth, it would continue to support respect of human rights. As my colleague has mentioned, the attempt to expand the prerogatives failed. I believe the United States didn't want to endanger its strategic alliance with Morocco, and the issue of human rights in Morocco is an open issue. We remember the reconciliation issue. And then on the African level, we can say that Morocco's strategic location close to Europe and Africa makes it valid for playing prominent roles in the future. And this is the Moroccan influence in Africa is better accepted by Africa than the European or American influence. Since we are running out of time, I would like to conclude that the U.S. investments in Morocco is still very limited and doesn't exceed 8% of the total investments in Morocco. Foreign Policy magazine said that Morocco has spent more than $20 million in lobbying for the U.S., which goes to show that the foreign policy in the United States isn't only related to policy makers and officials. There are other factors therein. Therefore, reinforcing the ties with the United States and making the most of the U.S. influence and role hinges on how we understand the decision-making process in the United States. We also have to raise the issue of interest in any such approach. Last, I conclude by saying that benefiting from the opportunities that the U.S. provides us with as an international great power is something we should take into consideration. Benefiting from this relationship with the U.S. would be very limited if Morocco were to act as part of an ensemble and not, unless it is a part of an ensemble, because this is the era of ensembles, of blocks, of multiple countries uniting together and consolidating their efforts. The Maghreb Union has to open up to the US, not to limit itself to the European Union. I believe the relationship with the United States will be on an equal footing in the future, so as to serve a number of regional and Arab interests as well. Thank you. We thank Dr. Idriss for abiding by the time. The third paper shall be presented on behalf of its author, who is Mr. Youssef al-Sawani, who is a professor of policy and international relations in the University of Tripoli in Libya. He has a number of publications on Libya, the policy, culture in the Arab world, strategic and international relations issues. He has a PhD in international relations from the United States. Mr. Zoheir al-Hamedi, a researcher in our center, will present this paper on his behalf. You have the floor, sir. He shall be given 15 minutes. Thank you, Dr. al-Nour. As the chairperson has mentioned, this paper is written by Dr. Youssef al-Sawani, entitled The U.S. and Libya, a Turbulent History and an Uncertain Future. I will attempt to abide by the content and conclusions that this paper brought about, without including my own opinions. This paper looks at political analyses to talk about the U.S. and Libyan relations since the early 50s until the latest contribution against Gaddafi, by the U.S. against Gaddafi. The thesis is that the U.S. policy in Libya isn't necessarily linked to the ambitions of the Libyan people unless they coincide with the U.S. interests, and that the main reason behind this tendency or trend is that Libya, as per the author of the paper, isn't as strategically important as other countries for the United States. Its role is to be solely an energy producer and energy exporter to the United States and Europe. The realistic theory is the most convenient to interpret the U.S. stances in Libya. The author divides the U.S.-Libyan relations into 6 phases. The first phase, since Libya got its independence in 1951, until the revolution in 1969. Such is a phase where the U.S. closely collaborated with Libya in the energy and military sectors. The U.S. had military bases on Libyan territories. The second phase is from 1969 to 1982. This is the area, or the period, the phase of conflict where Gaddafi nationalized oil production, the oil sector, and therefore entered into conflict with the United States. In the meantime, Gaddafi wanted to make the most of his oil resources and regional adventures, which put him in a greater conflict with the US, which accused him of supporting terrorism. Consequently, the United States cut off its diplomatic relations with Libya, and it imposed an oil embargo in 1982. The third phase.
The third period is the period of antagonism and animosity, which started with imposing sanctions on Libya, and then we started hearing about American accusations to Libya to be behind the bombing in Berlin and Lockerbie bombing also, which Libya was accused of being responsible for. From 2001 till 2011 was the rehabilitation period after a long period of sanctions, which severely impacted the economy. Some steps were taken so that Libya can return to the family of nations. As Dr. Yahya Zoubir said, when Libya paid large sums of money as compensation for what happened, although there are evidence and convictions amongst many that Libya was not responsible for Lockerbie attack, because Gaddafi realized that this was the only option open to him to go back to the family of nations. And then came the phase of direct military intervention by the US, and what the author calls new realism and leading from behind, as it's known. The United States did not intervene directly, of course, in Libya, but the military assets of the United States were used through NATO, which enabled France and Britain to intervene directly, militarily, that is, in Libya. The paper also considers that the Arab Spring started in Tunisia, of course, then it moved to Libya very quickly with a massive wave of protests. As a result of this popular uprising and accusations that the Libyan regime will commit massacres, and through the Security Council, two resolutions were passed, 1972 and 1973. 1973 authorized the use of military power in Libya. In fact, there's been some debate within the administration so far as intervening in Libya is concerned. One camp was advocating intervention, another was against it, but President Obama justified intervention, considering that it is linked to American interests, respecting human rights, and the duty of protecting civilians. This was the principle that the military intervention was based on by President Obama. In addition to all of this, the administration, in its decision to intervene in Libya, saw it fit that this intervention will be a reflection of the United States taking part in an action which is justifiable morally, heeding the lesson from the Iraq invasion, and they thought that this will consolidate the impression that the United States is siding with the protest movements by the Arab masses, and according to the author of the paper, the American intervention had, by and large, the hallmarks of a PR exercise and to give the impression that the United States is on the side of people. But a cold reflection on what happened, we realized that it was not only a justification for protecting civilians, but it was an attempt to get rid of the regime and get rid of Gaddafi himself. Therefore, there was some manipulation of the facts and publish facts which give the impression that what happened was justified, and the author bases his opinion on a study which was published by International Security in 2013 by a Harvard researcher, which concluded that the lessons heeded from the American intervention in Libya contradict many things we learned about the Libyan uprising, and mostly to say that NATO's intervention was based on protecting civilians, but also it had more to do with deposing the regime. And also the author says that although these conclusions by the Harvard researchers does not change the fact that what the Libyan regime has committed in acts of oppression against the people, it sheds light on the principles behind this intervention. And also the situation as was depicted by the media and in the West and strategic reports show that they were not concerned with defending human rights. Anyway, the current situation in Libya is rather bleak, and most reports from that country indicate that, and also the Libyan authorities call for help from outside powers, and especially after the Rome conference in 2014 shows that the United States and its allies were involved in something that they are paying the price for now after the fall of the Gaddafi regime. Regardless of the positive value that getting rid of a dictatorial regime like Gaddafi's can prove, outside intervention and the militarization of the uprising is unmistakably indicative of what happened, and a French official lately described the southern parts of Libya as becoming like a piece of hell or something. And anyway, what happened and the current situation proves that the United States does not care about anything but its own interests, and the intervention to protect civilians was nothing but a pretext to get rid of Gaddafi's regime. And now it was proven that that intervention was counterproductive, and the number of victims are multiplied by 7 to 10 times, and the violations of human rights, extremism is more prevalent, and also weapons from Libya have been spreading all over the region, which constitutes a threat to everybody. So therefore, to talk about a Libyan module for intervention under the current circumstances is not conducive to anybody, and it leads us to the main question: what is meant really by the principle of intervening for the protection of civilians as a principle? Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Zoheir Hamedi, for presenting this paper. This this session was allocated an hour and a half, but we only had just over an hour. Therefore, the time we have for questions will be very limited. Please, I beg of you to not not to exceed 1 point and not to take more than 1 minute in your comments or questions. Thank you. The chair spoke of that most population, the Arab population, is in Africa, and there are 9 Arab countries in the African continent. My question is about the American command in Africa, because we hear that the headquarters of that command will be moved to Tunisia or Morocco, and this indicates the role of Morocco. What is the relationship between North African countries and the American command in Africa, known as AFRICOM for short? I have a question to Mr. Idriss Lakrini and Yahia Zoubir. You spoke about the American relations with Morocco, and you elaborated on the reasons why this relationship is important. But all the roles you talked about, the possible roles of Morocco, although Morocco has no African legitimacy, because African countries since the mid-70s considered it as an occupying power of a certain region in Africa, and the question of the Western Sahara is dealt with as a colonial issue. And also, can't we say, in view of these facts, that Morocco is isolated geographically, and also in its relations with Algeria, its forces cannot move through Algeria? Doesn't this limit the role of Morocco in any American strategy? Also, my question to Mr. Yahia Zoubir: you said Morocco is a basic pillar in American relations, but I think with this pivot to Asia and America will need a country with more African credentials. I think Algeria, because it's in touch with Tunisia, Libya, and Mali, and Algeria comes first in armament, and that wouldn't this impact the need, the American need to a country other than Morocco, and maybe more inclined towards Algeria? Muazz Ramadani from Iraq. What the panelists said about Tunisia and Morocco reminds me of the policy adopted by Bismarck, the German Chancellor, when he tied other countries to Germany with close links, in a way that other countries cannot disengage from Germany. And consequently, it seems to me that the United States are applying this principle of Bismarck so far as Morocco and Tunisia are concerned, at least. So therefore, I ask, how can any American and relations between America, Tunisia, and Morocco based on any balanced approach. And also the colleague who talked about Libya, I don't know how we can possibly say that the United States benefited from the lesson of Iraq. What happened in Libya was a repeat of what happened in Iraq. A nationalist regime was deposed in Iraq, and the nationalist regime in Libya was deposed, and therefore we have chaos in both countries now as a result. Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. Dr. Zoubir, really, sometimes I feel bad for American decision makers. What can we expect from the US really realistically in a region that's been torn apart by interstate, rivalries for the past 50 years? And I'm not talking about intersocietal, conflicts. I'm talking about leadership incompatibilities in how they want to deal with each other. And then really the absence of a security architecture in North Africa is not really some kind of a mystery. So how can the United States realistically be part of the process, build a multilateral security architecture in the presence of those rivalries?
شكرا جزيلا. أعطي فرصة أخيرة. تفضل. تحول إلى الطاولة.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
In the name of God, the most merciful, the most compassionate. The North African region or Maghreb region was historically an area of influence for Europe and France. Lately, the United States realized the strategic importance of this area, and they've been trying lately to consolidate their influence. And in 2010, September 2010, the United States, in coordination with North African country, launched the initiative of partnership with the United States and North African countries, and Washington tried through economic means to consolidate its influence. My question to Mr. Idriss is, during the last 4 years from 2010 until now, many things happened. Are the new developments concerning the Arab Spring in Libya and Tunisia, Morocco and Algeria, to some extent, have these developments contributed to enhance American influence as the US wished in 2010, or was it counterproductive? We have 5 minutes left, so therefore I give these 5 minutes to the panelists for some final remarks. I give each one of them 5 minutes.
Okay. Regarding AFRICOM to be moved to Morocco or Tunisia, there is no truth to it. In fact, the U.S. has had a hard time finding any country in Africa to host AFRICOM. But Morocco did offer at some point and had demanded in exchange recognition of Moroccan sovereignty over Western Sahara. U.S. wanting to avoid alienating Algeria thought it was too heavy. Tunisia, there is now talk that there is a base in southern Tunisia, but there is no proof of that. Most African countries have refused. There were some, Kenya had also offered, but it did not work. And yes, the question regarding the rules about Morocco being excluded, Morocco withdrew from the the Organization of African Unity, which is today the African Union, in 1984, after the recognition of the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, by the organization. Yes, but Morocco has strong allies. I will let my friend Idriss respond to that. But somehow, even in the question of the Sahel, of which Morocco is not part, there have been attempts to force, Morocco into that sort of, the Algerians had come up with 3 other countries, Niger, Mali, and Mauritania, with a common command, but they wanted, both the Europeans and the United States try to impose Morocco in that organization, which they did not succeed in doing. For the Algerians to have accepted Morocco as part of that initiative would have been tantamount to recognizing Moroccan sovereignty over Western Sahara, which is a Sahelian country. So why wouldn't Algeria become so important to the United States? Of course, it's like the whole question that we've been asking about why is it that the United States supports Israel when its interests are with the Arab countries? So that is the question. But for historical reasons, I believe that no matter what, the Algerians cannot come close to the United States as much as Morocco, because Algeria has its own policies, has its, this kind of independence from a long time, and it depends on its supplies from Russia and also from some others, but it could not depend on the United States, because doing so, you don't want to be dependent on the United States for your weaponry when your main competitor or rival in the region is Morocco, which is supplied, with U.S. equipment. So one person asked also the question about the U.S. supplying the countries to Bismarck. That's something else. But for Libya, I can respond to something. It was asked for Youssef, since he's not here. I have to tell you, that I have spoken with high-level U.S. officials who have admitted that they made a mistake in Libya. From an operational point of view, they would say it was great, no losses of lives, and so on and so forth. But the consequences for the Sahel region, most of the weapons ended up in Mali, in northern Mali. Now, despite the intervention or French intervention, the situation in Mali is not resolved. The Tuareg question is still problematic, because most of the Tuaregs who were in Libya, who were part of the force, the Libyan force, fled or left the country. Left Libya, went to northern Mali, and that's when the MNLA proclaimed, an independent state, the Azawad, in the Azawad, and we know all that happened later also with Agrali, another movement, and now we have a situation not only where, on the eve, in 2009, the Gaddafi regime, whether one likes it or not, the Gaddafi regime had succeeded in de-radicalizing the jihadists. They had a meeting, they talked, and then Ali Ben, and I said Bani Belhaj, the other Belhaj, Abdul Hakim Belhaj, signed, they had a document of 900 pages or something, rejecting violence and so on. Now, Ben Haj became a head of a militia and so on after, during the revolution, and part of those jihadis who were freed from jail now are part of the problem that Libya is facing. Again, somebody said, about the Maghreb influence for France. It's, again, the U.S. for many periods, that's why I said, when you look at the various periods in which the U.S. was interested, it was only when it felt that either the Western power, the European power could not do it, or when it was a threat to the southern flank of NATO, like in the 1990s. One of after the cancellation of the electoral process in Algeria in 91, and then with the rise of the GIAs and so on, with the armed groups, that's when the U.S. also came back, and there was a sort of conditionality on the Algerians on how to bring, how to recognize because as I told you earlier, there were two groups in the United States. There were those what we call eradicators, who said, look, there is absolutely no discussion with the Islamists. A good Islamist is a dead Islamist, like, they did about the communists in the past during the Cold War. And you had others, namely Robert Peltro and so on, who were saying, no, you have to bring them under the tent, and, you have to have moderate Islamists. And what is a moderate Islamist for the U.S. administration is someone who does not oppose, U.S. interests, who recognizes the so-called peace process with Israel, and so on and so forth. So that is, But I will add also another dimension regarding the contradictions, if you wish, in U.S. policy, especially regarding the question of Western Sahara. And the question of Western Sahara, the United States tries to balance out its relationship with Morocco and Algeria. It encourages, after, when they had the Eisenstadt initiative, which wanted an integrated Maghreb, which failed, and Eisenstadt is still around trying to come up with it. He needs to do something, right? But it's not working because, if you forgive me, it's very important. If one does not understand that, there's, no point discussing it. But without the resolution of the conflict in Western Sahara, there is no way you're going to have that. And I'm sorry to tell my brother Idriss, the U.S. is not interested in investing in Morocco. It's not interested in the Moroccan economy. It's not important enough. The U.S. wanted in the 1990s an integrated Maghreb that would have stretched to Egypt. That would have been a real market, but not a market. Even Algeria, which has 20 billion in business with the United States, is not an important market for the United States. The United States needs a big region to be able to invest and to attract business people. But I would argue, and I have said it in their face to U.S. officials, you are responsible for the lack of integration of the Maghreb because you have created in the resolutions, UN resolutions on Western Sahara, a stalemate because each side can veto the other. It says, if you read all the resolutions every year on Western Sahara, it says, you have to have a mutually agreed, deal. So each side, Morocco says, I don't want to talk about anything but when they have the negotiations. I don't want to talk about anything but, the autonomy I'm offering you. And the Sahrawi says, we don't want to talk about anything if you don't put on the table the possibility of having a true referendum by which, with independence as, one of the options, which is basically the fundamental issue that began in the 1970s. The Sahrawis, whether one is in agreement or not, are entitled to a free and fair referendum, which is repeated in every resolution, but they created this stalemate. And as long as it's long the U.S. priority, Western Sahara, secondly, there is no war, there is no blood, so it's not very important. And then, it gives some parts to say, if we don't solve this problem, disgruntled Sahrawis may join jihadist groups. Morocco, of course, played on that and said, Sahrawis are linked to al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, which proved false. If you read even what happened in the British Parliament yesterday, British officials were saying there is no truth to it, and the U.S., if you read WikiLeaks and all that stuff, it said the same way. So these are some of the contradictions that Dr. Azmi was talking about.
You took so long.
Sorry, I stopped.
أنا آسف دكتور يحيى took 10 minutes actually. إذا استغرق 10 دقائق.
الفرصة الآن عند الدكتور إدريس لكريني.
We give the floor to Dr. Idriss, who has only 5 minutes, to be fair.
شكرا للسيد الرئيس. سأحاول أولا فيما يتعلق بالشرعية الإفريقية أو خروج المغرب من الاتحاد الإفريقي.
When it comes to legitimacy, I was talking about Morocco stepping out of the Union within a specific context. In the 80s, it stepped out
مقومات الدولة بالمفهوم القانون الدولي
because there was a member
لأنه انسحب من منظمة
that doesn't have the full status of a state. So Morocco withdrew
لا يتوفر على مقومات
because
الدولة.
this other party isn't a state.
الخروج المبكر
On the other hand, this early withdrawal didn't
أولا
isolate Morocco from its neighboring countries. On the contrary, it strengthened its ties with a number of African countries, except for some countries. And I speak about the latest visit by the king to Mali, to the Ivory Coast, to Gabon, and this was a highly successful visit when it comes to the agreements that were signed.
جوانب روحية في جوانب ثقافية في جوانب تاريخية لا ينبغي أن ننكرها أو أن
There are a lot of dimensions, historical, cultural, and others that we should never forget, even though they're outweighed by political aspects. Morocco also entered into multiple blocs and organizations in parallel to the African Union.
انخرط فيها وبالتالي لا يمكننا أن نتحدث عن
Therefore, we cannot truly talk about the isolation of Morocco and its withdrawal from the African Union means that it withdrew from Africa, all in all. This is not true. When it comes to the peer-to-peer or dealing on an equal footing, I talk once again about the Maghreb Union. We cannot imagine the conflict that followed World War II. However, the contribution of some parties, such as France,
التي لا يمكننا أن نتصورها موجودة في منطقة الاتحاد المغربي
in view of the multiple challenges in the African Corn, after the entrance of France and its building of different ties with all those different countries, a lot of challenges were overcome. A lot of concerns were also put on the side.
الاتحاد المغربي يدعم يعني
I think that supporting the Maghreb Union
المغربي سيدعم حتما القضية
will definitely help solving this issue. Another point is related
ليبيا أو بحضور أشار أحد الإخوة
to Libya
مستقبل العلاقات الأمريكية
and the future of US-Moroccan relations
أن نستحضر في هذا الشيء
under this light. I think we have to recall the developments in Libya. I hope that Libyans be able to resolve their internal conflicts away from any foreign intervention. Foreign intervention may help revive a number of extremists who feed on international presence in the region. We hereby recall the events in Iraq and other countries. And when we talk about Libya, we must not forget the role of the countries in the region. I believe that the countries of the region should play a constructive role to pave the way and promote dialogue inside Libya away from any foreign intervention that may jeopardize this opportunity. That is all I have. Thank you. On behalf of the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, I would like to thank all of our speakers. I also thank you for your presence, and now we will have lunch. Thank you.